Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, and today I'll be discussing Elu Thingol, the king of the Sindarin elves, and easily the greatest Sindarin king ever. Considering the competition he has, this isn't exactly a tough win for him. I've come across a great many people, even friends, who apparently don't like Elu Thingol. And I'm going to be honest, he's probably my favorite of the original three elves who went to Valinor to represent the elves. He's one of my top 5 favorite Silmarillion characters, and I'm going to be honest, I actually think he's one of the most sympathetic characters. Now, I know this is not going to make me too many friends, but hopefully I'll be able to rehabilitate the character in at least almost as good a fashion as Girl Next Gondor could. So, let's get going. At the start of the story of Elu Thingol, he is one of 3 ambassadors chosen alongside Finwë and Ingwë to Aman to represent the elves. The 3 then return and report what they saw to the elves. Thingol would prove himself perhaps the most unique of the 3 original kings when he would wander away from his tribesmen and come across Melian. Now, it's not clear exactly why Melian was in that grove, but there she was, singing. It's then that Thingol gave chase after her because, of course, she ran off. And when she at last came to a stop and the 2 were to look upon one another, they were to stare into each other's eyes for centuries. In the meantime, the Teleri were naturally very confused and worried over their king. And it would end up being Thingol's brother who would lead them to the sea. When Elu Thingol awoke, though, from his stupor, he took Melian for a wife and brought her back to his people. The 2 were recognized as king and queen. Setting himself up in Doriath and later helping set up Menegroth, Thingol would become the king of Beleriand, ruling over Beleriand for a lengthy period of time, while the other elves ventured off to Aman. It's important to remember that Thingol ruled Beleriand not in a heavy-handed, stupid way, but competently and in such a manner that he got the respect and admiration of a great many people at the time. Thingol would set up good relations with the dwarves. It's been said that it was his own stupidity and arrogance that drove the dwarves against him. Now, I'm going to make the argument against that in a bit, but for now, let's bear in mind he set up really good relations with the dwarves, and they were keen for an alliance with him. What is more is that Thingol, later on, though reluctant to share close ties with the Noldor thing of an alliance, was still willing to set up something of an alliance with them, notably with somewhat the likes of Maethros, of course Finrod Felagund, and this in spite of his own dislike for the Noldor. And who could blame him, considering they didn't exactly show their best side when they first showed up in Beleriand, essentially having a dibs, it's mine kind of argument for a lot of the land. Thingol also ended up initially a little reluctant to accept humans. Thingol was made to watch as his daughter fell in love with one of them. That said, it has often been argued that it was a rather arrogant thing and foolish thing of him to refuse to accept Beren as a son-in-law when Luthien all but presented him to her father. And there's no denial that can be had there that Thingol had apparently forgotten how his own relationship kind of worked with Melian and how similar it might be to Beren and Luthien's situation. We now reached a point when people really start to become rather hostile towards him. The reason for the hostility towards him stems from, first, his imprisoning of Luthien when he would not abide her love for Beren, imprisoning her in a large tree. Tolkien was relying on fairy tale ideas there, and that in the early writing of the elves, they were not the soft and more child-friendly characters of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. They were far more dangerous figures in the Silmarillion, and Thingol chief amongst them in some ways. The reasons for his wanting to shield his daughter is not bad. What parent would not want to protect their child from the outside world, to protect them from harm? Thingol, though, is misbehaving, obviously, in such a way that it shows that he is more concerned about his daughter than anyone else, and that he is not willing or ready to let her grow up quite yet. But we have to bear in mind that when Luthien goes away and later comes back with Beren, Thingol is ready and willing to abide by his word. He said, "Get me a Silmaril and I'll recognize your marriage to my daughter." And he agrees to this. He could have easily walked back his words, but he didn't. He doesn't. I do think that the character should be given a lot of credit for that, for abiding by his word. When Luthien goes off to Mandos to demand Beren back, we know that Thingol is prostrate with grief and catatonic for a time, the reason being his great and profound love for his daughter. I guess it's just that seeing how much he worried over his child and seeing how far he was willing to go for her and how he could not survive without her emotionally, I have a lot of sympathy for Thingol. I myself really like Little Mermaid and kind of see Thingol as being like Triton from that movie. I think that we need to look at Thingol's story not from the point of view of a child, but from a parent's point of view to an extent. He is a parent trying to protect his daughter. On the other hand, he should be more willing to let her go. She has reached adulthood. It's time for her to go. But in the fairy story context, it is necessary that she break past the barriers and the boundaries set for her by her father for her to escape, go on her own quest to claim the man she wants, and to also prove herself worthy of the man she wants, and for him to prove himself worthy of her. Thingol is an obstacle in this situation. It's important for the child to break free from the parent's barriers and boundaries in order for the child to surpass the parent in some ways and to become an adult themselves. This is part of the natural process. When it comes to the love he has for others, he does care. I don't think there's any other way of reading the text, especially when Beren and Luthien return. He is more than happy to let them essentially elope and gives his blessings to Beren and Luthien and recognizes Luthien as his heiress. We have to bear in mind, given how proud he was, this is quite something. What is more is that where he was previously a little bigoted against humans, when Turin Turambar shows up on his doorstep as a child, Thingol picks him up and puts him on his lap and presents him as his foster son, because Turin is a distant relative of Beren. This willingness to accept the first human to show up on his doorstep after Beren shows that Thingol has opened his heart up to the rest of the world. He's not the same icy character he once was. That being said, the Turin story ends in tragedy as Turin, of course, passes away, and Thingol ends up evidently grief-stricken because he lost his friend Baelig. Emphasized that Baelig was his friend. He seemed very polite and appreciative of what Baelig Strongbow had to offer and honored him above almost all other elves. As to Turin, we have to bear in mind that in Norse society and in Norse mythology, a foster family is as good as an actual family. In those old customs, when you took someone up as your foster son, it was a profound act. You were to treat your foster son as though they were your actual son. And we have countless Nordic stories and sagas to prove it. In this context, Thingol would have been expected to care for Turin as though Turin was his son. And for him to have buried Turin is akin to burying his own son. At least that's how I would read the text. And if you read it from that point of view, with that Norse mythological and cultural background in mind, you get there a much more tragic character. And now we reach the final linchpin in the argument against Thingol, that of the Nauglamir Silmaril, namely that it was extreme vanity to merge the two together. But arguably, Thingol's not exactly operating with a full deck at this point. For one thing, he's grief-stricken, on top of which there is the dragon sickness of the Nauglamir and the curse of the Silmarils that seem to have had a effect of making anyone who has them want them and crave to wear them and keep them close at all times, no matter who they are, to such an extent that the ability to resist one of these curses is an impressive accomplishment. Thingol resisted the Silmaril for a time, which is impressive, but eventually he was gonna, no matter what, possibly give in. We should also bear in mind the Nauglamir, with its dragon sickness that had pervaded it due to Glaurung, it at once began to seep into him, and doubtless he was as affected by it as Thor in Oakenshield was in The Hobbit, with Thingol, of course, being subject to the Silmaril curse, that is to say, worshipping the Silmaril and wanting to wear it at all times, and with the Nauglamir working its magic so that he doesn't want to be separated from it either. Fusing the two seems to have been the most natural thing to such a person in such a frame of mind. The dwarves, of course, were no less fixated by these cursed gems, and I don't think Thingol was mistreating his dwarvish smiths, as we do have on good account in the Silmarillion that Thingol paid them well and was quite fond of the goods they had made him. The dwarves don't seem to have hated him per se. I think that it's a matter that both were affected by these curses almost at once. It was foolish of Thingol to dabble with these things, but on the other hand, given the curses, could he really resist them? That said, are the dwarves guilty? Is Thingol guilty? This is what really drove me to want to make this video, and I'm actually going to propose the theory that possibly neither are fully guilty, and that it's more the Silmaril and Nauglamir that are guilty, so to speak. You have cursed artifacts that make people desire them above all else, and you have dwarves and an elf whom fall prey to these curses. And if you were to never throw either in front of them, I find it very unlikely that they would have turned on one another. I find it hard to believe the dwarves would slay Thingol if it was not for the Silmaril Nauglamir, just as I find it unlikely that Thingol would anger the dwarves and turn on them if it was not for the Silmaril Nauglamir. Given the nature of all who touch the Silmaril are all but reduced to ash because of almost every example of anyone who's ever worn them, and because of the Feanorian Oath, it's a matter that was very likely out of Thingol's control, at least in my view. So tell me what you think of this video in the comment section. What do you think of Thingol? And don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Morgoth trying to smash Fingolfin into itty bitty pieces.